This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Malick Hour, celebration of the life and work of American filmmaker Terrence Malick. Hello everybody and welcome to a episode of Writers on Film, the Malick Hour. This is a sort of subdivision of Writers on Film, and we're going through each work by Terrence Malick, and we're coming towards the end. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Matt Zoller Seitz, who is going to talk with me about Terrence Malick's last feature film, A Hidden Life. Thanks for coming, Matt.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Just before we start on Malick, let's talk a little bit about Wes Anderson, because you've just published a book on Asteroid City, which is not your first book on Wes Anderson, am I right?
That's true. It's, how many are there now? 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this is the 6th one. The original one was the Wes Anderson collection, which covered the first 7 films. And then Grand Budapest Hotel came out, and we did a separate book on that. And then there's been books on Isle of Dogs, French Dispatch, now Asteroid City. And there's another one in the works now on the Phoenician Scheme. So it's going to continue to go as long as people want it.
Yeah, well, he's certainly a very rich subject for writers, I can sort of see why he's such. I loved his films, the Roald Dahl short stories that he did for Netflix as well. I thought they were superb.
Yeah, no, they were really good, and I thought it was funny that he finally won an Oscar for the short films, and he couldn't accept them because he was busy shooting something after all this time.
Matt, you also have a internet bookstore, which is I've always felt, well, you came on the podcast at our 100th episode, and I always wanted to have you on because it seemed like there was this symbiosis in your relationship with books and mine, that we were kind of aiming for the same goal.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that was true. I've often said that my formative experiences that kind of put me down the path that I have been on my entire life was in college. I had 2 jobs at the same time. One was working at the Inwood Theater in Dallas, which at the time was an art house movie theater. And the other job was working at the college bookstore. And, I just worked all over the store, in the back, in the front, you name it. And I actually did a newsletter for the bookstore briefly. It was eventually canned because they said, wait a minute, why is he criticizing books that we sell? So that I hadn't thought that through, clearly. But yeah, books, I have a ridiculous number of my own books, and I kind of have joked, and it's not really even a joke, that a lot of my life is about figuring out how to hold on to my books. Sometimes you move and you got to move into a smaller place, and the smallest apartment I lived in the last 15 years, I basically had pretty much every available inch of wall space was bookshelves that I'd built into it, and it looked like me and my kids were living in a library. So MZS.press was started 6 years ago, roughly, originally just to sell my own books and, let people get autographed books if they didn't live in the same city with me. And it gradually expanded to include books by people I knew, and then books by people I didn't know but admired, and then, old books, used books, signed books, and now we've added merchandise, and it's all arts related, like movies, television, literature, music. We have sections on disability, identity, a lot of really rare items too. So it's kind of a potluck, but people seem to be responding to it, which is really, really nice. And I do feel like Judith Carter, who's my partner and the executive director of the store, we really feel like it's kind of a public mission statement, a public mission in a way. It's a small business, but we don't make that much money on it. And it's really more about offering people an alternative to Amazon and Barnes and Noble and the big chains, and also spotlighting work by people who you may not know about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you, John.
Absolutely. Bring that spotlight over here.
We'll be, everybody listening to this, we're going to be carrying John's book. We're still working out the details, but yeah, But, it's a kind of thing where some of our biggest successes have been things that they're not new books. They're things that came out a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago that people didn't know about. They're like, oh my God, there's a book about Tim Burton, in the shape of a giant piece of candy. I'm kidding. I wish such a book existed.
I would buy that. That would definitely put me down and pre-order that, please.
I'm really, really happy to be on the show again. I always enjoy talking to you, John, and particularly about our shared obsession with Terrence Malick.
Well, let's get into it. I've read you on Terrence Malick quite a lot because you've written quite a lot about Terrence Malick over the years as films have come out and you've responded to them. And I've always found your pieces really fascinating. In fact, I kind of wanted you, there was a bit of me that I really wanted you on for The New World, because that's one piece I remember reading and being like, wow, this is great. But then I thought maybe that'll be too on the nose. And I also read your piece on A Hidden Life, and I thought, well, okay, that might be one that's very interesting as well.
Well, the New World is one of my favorite films of all time, as you know. It's really hard to choose a favorite Terrence Malick film. That's usually the one for me. Sometimes Days of Heaven edges it out, but I think it might be a three-way tie now with A Hidden Life. And it's really kind of a shame that A Hidden Life came out at, I guess you would say, an awkward time, not just during the first Trump administration. I can't believe I have to say that. And it was specifically a warning against creeping fascism and the sacrifices people have to make in order to resist it, but also because 20th Century Fox, which had a division that released A Hidden Life, had been absorbed by Disney. And to put it mildly, Terrence Malick is not really what you would call a Disney brand, and I think it really got buried. And you look back on what the major studios that released his previous films did with stuff like The New World and particularly The Thin Red Line, which did very, very well and got Oscar nominations, and also Tree of Life. It was just night and day. Like, I won't say it was buried exactly, but it was definitely kind of left on the stoop without notice.
It was left by the side of the road as they drove off.
And it's, like all of his films, it's a movie that really needs to be seen on the largest screen possible. And a lot of times people couldn't even see it at all. They just had to wait for it to be on home video. And it's a shame, because I do think it's one of his masterpieces. And also it's as close, I think, and he doesn't give interviews and hasn't since 1978, but I bet that if you asked him about it, he would tell you that it did have something to do with what was then the current situation. I mean, it really feels like almost like the kind of thing that Spielberg does in his historical films, where he's talking about what's happening right now, but the subject is something that happened 20 years ago or 40 years ago.
Yeah, there's something in the air that he's picking up right now, even as it's purporting to be a period film. Just before we get into the film full on, what was your first film with Terrence Malick? What was your first encounter?
I think it might have been Badlands.
Right.
I think it might have been Badlands. And I think I was in high school, and it was recommended by a friend of mine who was a big film buff. And I'd never seen anything like it. And it was a huge, huge influence on me. Malick has been a huge influence on me in a lot of ways. And my parents were jazz musicians, and I grew up around jazz. And I think that probably has a lot to do with my affinity for people like Terrence Malick, but also Spike Lee, Martin Scorsese, John Cassavetes, Mike Lee. These are all people who are using a non-standard approach to narrative. And that's not to say that there isn't a story or a plot, because there is, but that this spontaneous, semi-improvisational method of creating a story, creating characters, creating images, and then finding the structure kind of intuitively. That's not something that commercial cinema typically does, and it's definitely something that you're advised against doing if you're a film student. And it really speaks to me, and I feel like it captures at its best something very true about how life is actually lived, how the world is actually experienced. And A Hidden Life is just a beautiful, beautiful movie, and in some ways it feels to me like a companion to his early films, like Badlands and particularly Days of Heaven, in the way that it has a story, it has characters, it has themes, but it's also about how these enormous forces of history and culture are happening all around these characters who are relatively powerless in the greater scheme of things. And these momentous occurrences are interspersed with just their regular daily lives. Like you see Franz, the main character, who's the conscientious objector during World War II. You see him and his wife and kids just living in their little rural mountain community. They're baling hay, they're cutting fields, they're raising livestock, and even when something really big and dramatic has happened, it'll be followed by a scene like maybe 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes long, just showing normal life. And that's what actually happens. And that's something that movies don't usually show you. It's like there's always things are happening at the same time. Like it might be you see mom and dad in the kitchen and the kids playing in the living room, and on the TV they're saying the president has been shot, but it's not often that you see that alternation, and I think that's part of what makes this movie so special.
Yeah, I think when this film was announced, Malick said, he was sort of suffering something of a critical backlash, I should say. Sorry, not creative, because creatively I think he was kind of peaking. He was doing lots of amazing work, even though, I mean, I like your idea of the jazz thing, and when I was talking to some people, there was definitely that was used as the idea that when he was traveling around and doing the latest movie, Way of the Wind, he would refer to it as his jazz group. He had his camera and his actors, and he was just going out and staying in hotels and doing that sort of thing. And I think that was true of quite a lot of those films like Knight of Cups and Song to Song. But there was a public statement where he said, I've repented not having a script, not keeping keeping a little tighter hold on the story.
What was the timeline on him saying that, and where did he say it? I missed that.
He said it around about 2017 or 2018, so it was really prior to no, wait a second, the film was in post-production 2 years, so yeah, it would have been about 2017, because he was about to go and film this, and he said it in the context of there was a showing of The Voyage of Time in one of the, it wasn't a cinema, it was like a science institute, it was MIT or something like that. And he did a sort of improv Q&A where he just turned up and said, okay, I think it was with Brian Greene, the astrophysicist. And he just referred to what he was working on next. And he said that he was going to go and go back to a script. Now, talking to the people involved in the film, Valerie Pachner and August Diehl and Jörg Widmer, various people, they were kind of saying, well, yeah, he had a script, but then he sort of tossed it after the first couple of days and just went and he knew what he needed. He knew the thrust of the story and where he needed to go, but he didn't want to make scenes as such. He didn't want to, he wanted them to do stuff rather than have any, play out dialogue and all the rest of it. He just wanted them to do stuff and talk and chat and all the rest of it. And then he would try and capture that with Widmer as his sort of, who'd already worked with him from New World on. He'd been a camera operator for Chivo for all of the films prior to this one.
Well, that's interesting. It reminds me of reading about the production methods of Robert Altman. Altman always had a script. And in many cases, the script ended up being nominated for an Oscar, but he wasn't beholden to it. And the writers, most of the writers, I don't know about all of them, they seem to understand that that's what you were getting into, that what you were doing was providing a roadmap, which Robert Altman would then he'd either drive on the marked roads or he'd wander off into the underbrush for a while and see what else was down there. And Malick is, I think I said in one of the pieces I wrote about the New World that I feel like what he's doing is he's creating, it's almost like he's trying to create a documentary. Like there's something documentary-like about the way he captures life. And it's a little, it's more sort of lushly beautiful, but it's the imagery, but it's nimble. It's not studied at all. There are not a lot of virtuoso shots in the way that we typically think of them, where like you don't have like a 4 or 5 minute tracking shot with hundreds of people and objects and individuals moving in and out of the frame. And at the end of it, you go, wow, what a great piece of choreography. It's not really Malick's thing. What I think of when I think of a wow moment in a Terrence Malick film is something that was caught. It's something that feels instantaneous and unique and of the moment. even if it was premeditated, and a lot of times it wasn't, like the moment, the little part of the New World near the end where Wes Stoodie's Powhatan character is in England and he's in a hedge, he's in a sculpture garden, like of shrubbery and trees, and he's seeing the way the English, these estates, they sort of treat trees and shrubs as a thing that you shape and sculpture as raw material, which is anathema to the way that he had always lived. And he's just walking around kind of touching the vegetation, and there's no dialogue in it, and it's a very brief moment, but it says so much about the differences between the old world and the new, and between his culture and the culture of the English. I can't even imagine what that would look, like how did that come about? And Pocahontas turning cartwheels as she runs through the garden in that final montage. So many moments like in Badlands, like going back to Badlands when Martin Sheen as Kit, he's out down by the riverbank and he's had that wonderful kind of date, I guess you would say, and he says, I'm going to take a rock with me to remember this day by, and he picks up this kind of big rock and then he holds it in his hand for a second and he goes, well, maybe a smaller one, and like it's just great stuff.
Originally he wants to smash their hands with it. Well, we'll smash our hands and that way we'll remember. And it's like,
it's just ludicrous.
Surely you'll remember anyway.
It is. And it's funny too, because like there's an example, and there's so many throughout his work, of people trying to fix an important moment and sort of commemorate it or make it ceremonial as it's happening. Like people are constantly trying to narrativize their lives in Terrence Malick films, or extract some sort of literary meaning from what they're going through, or draw some lesson. And my colleague at New York Magazine, Bill Beery, wrote a wonderful piece for the Museum of the Moving Image website, and it's online somewhere, pretty easy to find, about the Malick's use of language, particularly voiceover. And as you know, he's gotten criticized a lot over the years for the use of voiceover, in some cases multiple voiceovers, which are these kind of searching, poetic, almost like interior monologues. I guess a lot of people who don't like his work, they zero in on that in particular and say that it's simplistic, that it's like greeting cards or something like that. But Bilge's point, which I 100% agree with, is like, this is something that we all do. We try to find these profound, maybe pithy, maybe elaborate ways to capture something, to kind of fix it. And reality can't be fixed that way. It's like, it ends up like one of those butterfly collections where it's just a bunch of dead bugs pinned behind glass, like the life is gone. I think he gets that. And he dramatizes it in a way that almost no other filmmaker does.
Yeah, and I think there's a variety in it as well that is often unappreciated. Holly's voiceover is different to Linda's in Days of Heaven, is different to the chorus of Thin Red Line, is different. Even the versions of New World, the voiceover becomes increasingly complicated as he goes back into the edit, so you get John Smith doing sort of like a voiceover, which is very much him reading one of his books out loud, and while he's doing it, underneath that there's another voiceover going, I didn't know what I was doing, who am I even, so you've got this public pronouncement of intent, and underneath this sort of private insecurity of a man who's totally at a loss for where he is in the world.
That's totally true. And I find, speaking of the multiple cuts in the New World, the 3-hour version, which I think was home video only, that one was fascinating. That's I like all of the cuts to some degree. My favorite is probably the second theatrical cut, which I think is 235 minutes. But I like all of them. And the 3-hour cut, it's almost like he's experimenting with the idea of making it more structured, making it more literary. And it's almost like you're reading this epic novel, and it's broken into 3 sections, which more or less correspond to the points of view of the 3 main characters. Not exactly, but close enough. And even there, it resists that sort of neatness. You can feel the churning, contradictory emotions of the characters, and that army of supporting characters, and all of that incident just sort of straining at the sort of windsock that he's trying to pour everything into.
When we talk about Hidden Life and the voiceover there, I mean, the thing that's interesting there, I think, is that he's using the letters between the husband and wife who are at the center of this, Franz and they've got sort of very phonetically similar names. It's Franz and Franziska, so Jagerstatter, and this was a book that was published and edited and was part of the sort of the attempt to somehow protect their reputations, because their reputation in the village was not that great. They weren't seen as being sort of this, certainly Franz wasn't seen as being this sort of secular saint or anything like that. He was seen as being sort of an obstinate man who left his wife a widow and his children fatherless for a moral act which had no consequence. That was kind of his reputation until this book came out, and I think there was a documentary in the 60s as well, which sort of, revived interest in him. Well, revived interest in him. There was no interest in him until this happened.
It's so interesting. The title of it is so interesting, A Hidden Life. There's so many ways you can read that. He's a this is a life. It's a life that we would not know about normally, because it's not about a king or a president or a general or a tycoon. It's an ordinary person who is going through these cataclysmic historical events with his family. But also, I think the hidden life is the life of I think most people have this. Some people don't. But there's kind of, I believe there is an innate morality. I think there's something inside of everyone that knows on a really fundamental level what's right and what's wrong. That as we grow up and as we encounter other adults and institutional systems, that inner morality is either teased out and amplified, or it's suppressed, or methods are taught by which it can be suppressed so that people can make money without thinking about consequences, or enact their political will without considering the effect on other people. A lot of it comes down to just other people exist. We should care about other people.
Yeah, basic kindness, basic.
Yeah, and A Hidden Life. I just keep thinking about how prescient it was. It was really, not even prescient. I mean, it was, I really think, it had to have been like, it's not like Terrence Malick never reads a newspaper. He knows what's going on. It's his country. And the idea that he's making a film about an ordinary person, a person of, a man of no consequence, as the phrase goes, deciding to do something moral, make a moral statement, resist the Nazis, just resist them, just say no to them. Like, it's not like he's going in there and throwing Molotov cocktails through the windows of government offices or something. He's just saying no. They're like, say Heil Hitler, and he's like, no thanks.
It's almost like he's driven. It's like, I can't. It's almost like it's. Yeah. I have such a moral, it's a core value which just will not allow me to do this and stay the same. I think one of the high points of the film for me, or one of the most expressive lines, is when his lawyer says, you sign this and you'll be free tomorrow. And he says, well, I'm free today. Yeah. I'm in prison, but I'm free, And I just that line, along with the George Eliot quote at the very end, are the two moments in the film which I sort of, there are several more, I guess, but they touch me to the point of, tears.
The point about him, finally they're like, look, we're drafting you. We don't care if you prove Hitler or not. We're drafting you, and you're going into the army. And he is a conscientious objector, but he's still part of the army. The only way to truly resist people like the Nazis or any fascists is to really stand up to them and risk physical injury, imprisonment, or death. And he's not there yet. And there's a scene where Franz is in a military jail, and he's just constantly being abused and humiliated by these guards that want to break him. And a lawyer asked him, does it really matter if you're not carrying a rifle? Does it matter if you're not actively shooting at other people if you're part of the army? If you're filling up sandbags and you're shining shoes and you're helping the people who are shooting people? That's a good question. Certainly he is, by any account, by virtue of his choices, more moral than the people who just say yes to everything. But it is incremental. But, that's also the kind of nitpicking that goes on in any situation where authoritarians are in control, where the people who have sold out The people who have completely capitulated, never gave it a second thought, will always go and kind of nitpick somebody who's taking any kind of action that constitutes resistance and going, well, are you really resisting? Are you really opposing people? If you're, it's like that cartoon, like we should reform the system somewhat. And that guy comes out of the well and says, but you are part of the system. I am very smart. Like there are people who will call other people out as hypocrites only if they're doing something that seems virtuous, even to a tiny degree, but it makes them feel better about having no ethics.
I love that it captures that very well in terms of the village and the pressure that they have to submit to, and also the fact that there are people. It's really well done how the village is complicated. The village is a microcosm, so there are other farm workers who are saying, who they huddle and say, so what's going on then? What are you going to do? Do you believe in the war? And that's a brilliant conversation. Do you believe in the war? Because not really. And they're not saying like, oh yeah, I'm a total anti-Nazi or anything. It's just like, I don't really read the newspaper that much, so it doesn't seem right, and the mayor is the one who's the most sort of stomping around and, giving a speech that you kind of think, wow, you're really sort of protesting too much a little bit here. I'm not sure you entirely believe in this yourself.
One of the constants in this movie is people screaming at him, yelling at him, rating him because he keeps saying no. He's like Bartleby the Scrivener, sort of.
That's a good comparison.
And one of the common elements in these tirades is it doesn't matter. Your resistance doesn't matter. It's not important. It's of no consequence. Why are you even doing it? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And it's like, well, if it doesn't matter, why are people absolutely determined to break him? Why do they lose control of themselves? Why do they immediately raging at him? Their veins bulging out, getting purple faced, like looking like they're on the verge of angry crying. If it doesn't matter. It obviously does matter. If you're going to go to that trouble to just dog on this one completely, in the greater scheme of things, insignificant farmer and try to get him to say yes, he must be important. The saying he's not important over and over only confirms how important he is. Otherwise, the entire state wouldn't be worried about this guy. Like, it wouldn't have gone up the chain of command. You got to do something about this guy because he keeps saying no to us. We got to keep turning up the heat until finally he breaks and says yes. If it's not important, what do they care about? Why are they screaming at him?
There's this sort of bucolic existence that is there in the farm, and there's, it's certainly true that it's a major theme in Malick. It can sometimes be reductive in the way it's expressed, but that relationship to the natural world, this is, I love the way Malick in Badlands and Thin Red Line and Days of Heaven especially, yes, they have a relationship with the natural world, but it's also they can also be kind of indifferent to it, or they can be kind of working in it, rather than, there's one bit very early on in the film where Franz sort of walks out into a field and kind of is just looking at the trees. And it's kind of interesting because it's like where it's almost like rare that you have a character really in Days of Heaven, Richard Gere doesn't sort of notice how great the colors of the twilight are. He's just going to work every day,
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't really know a whole lot about Malick's political views. I know he became kind of more of a granola crunching Christian towards the later part of his life, but there does seem something almost kind of Marxist about the way he photographs labor and lives of laborers. I think of that sequence in Days of Heaven. I think there's more than one sequence actually showing the almost entirely immigrant workforce on the farm picking the crops ahead of the threshing machine, and they're like right in front of the blades. They're throwing things into the blades. They could lose a finger, they could lose a hand, they could trip and get run over. And everyone just kind of knows that that's a risk. And it seems like no one protests it. There's no discussion of, hey, this is dangerous, this is inhuman. It's just the job they have to do. They don't have a choice. It's that or they don't eat.
Absolutely. And I think this connects to something which I do think the politics of Malick's films have been very under spoken about, if that's a correct phrase. Because this film starts with Triumph of the Will, and it starts with Nazi propaganda, and it starts with the idea of Aryans, and something that Jagastata and his family are kind of the model of. They are kind of the propaganda. You know, these are white family, blonde-haired children in the fields in Wagnerian. You know, the New World uses Wagner very prominently in these Wagnerian landscapes. And it's kind of it's inviting comparison with Hitler propaganda. It's saying, okay, what did these people think, and this specific person, what did he think?
Yeah, yeah, and it's true. That's a good point about the family is just it almost looks like those hideous AI illustrations that your reactionary boomer uncle posts on Facebook of like the blonde, the sort of eerily robotic looking blonde family around the table with the big turkey or the ham, and it's almost like offensive. I wonder if it's like offensive on some level to the Nazis that this guy who looks like he could be on a recruiting poster won't be a Nazi. I mean, if anybody's like a sort of like made on the drawing table version of the perfect Nazi, it's this dude, but he won't even salute.
Yeah, he's tall, he's got, he's wiry, he looks like he's got a good reach. You know, when you see him bayoneting, the straw in his initial sort of round in the militia, it's like there's a really funny shot there where it looks like he's really they're all doing their war cries and he's kind of smirking. He can't quite take it seriously. And like you were saying earlier
absurd,
about there's sort of like it's almost that improvised thing. It's captured that moment. It's not lingered on at all.
There's so many great moments where, we talked about this earlier, but this idea of history, the great momentous tide of history being integrated into this sort of ordinary daily life, but also ordinary daily behavior. Like you see the little idiosyncrasies of people's character, like the thing you just mentioned, but also the Franz Rogowski's character, who's this guy who is apparently just naturally a pacifist. And they've got these dummies that are used for bayonet practice, and he he arranges them so that they look like they're Terrence Malick lovers necking in a field. That's how not suited to the military life this guy is. And also moments that are like the black comedy of Terrence Malick is also something that I don't think is appreciated. I don't know where people get this thing that he's humorless or pretentious. He's funny. He's very dry though. And I think it's probably easy to miss how funny his movies are, but like they're funny in a way that's kind of breathtakingly weird. Like that moment where, oh God, what is it? It's like they're in a coffee shop or something, and he's on his way out, and there's an umbrella that's crooked, and he straightens it, and then they put him in the car, and you see a shot through the back windshield, and you see the Nazi officer who was who's on the sidewalk. Like as the car drives away, I suppose when he thinks that they can't see him anymore, he does this bizarre little dance on the sidewalk.
It's not like a slappy thigh dance.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. It's really bizarre, but it's the kind of thing that like people do. And I remember my mother had a boss who, when my brother and I would come to work with her and we'd sit in the waiting room, it was in between his office and the bathroom. So he would have to pass through the waiting room. And every time he passed by us, he'd look at us and give a big grin and make this Daffy Duck noise. Like every single time. And even as a kid, I thought, how weird. Why does he do that? Why does he feel compelled to do that? He didn't even say hello, how you boys doing? It was always that's like something Terrence Malick would put in one of his movies.
Absolutely, yeah. Lantern Mills has a chicken dance apparently that Terrence Malick himself does, because he's acting in that movie. And I often think that him doing that chicken dance is the reason that we will never see Lantern Mills, because it's just like that would be the end of his reputation as this serious, thoughtful philosopher.
There's a moment towards the end where, I guess they're lined up in front of a firing squad, and this guy comes out with a clipboard with a piece of paper for everybody to write down their final words.
Yeah.
And the guy next to Franz says, he looks at him like with this stricken, sad expression. It says, "What do I write?" It's almost like borderline Mel Brooks.
Yeah, that's such a moment of yeah, what is big enough or small enough for this to fit, in this moment. So it's sort of both trivial and it's everything and nothing in its meaning. I,
Yes. Yes.
that is so it's such a blackly absurd that whole sequence I think is has this combination of so many different emotions. Just to go back a little bit. I also like the fact that the postman going by, I mean, that's another of those sort of darkly humorous things, that the postman ringing his bell and going by becomes the sort of leitmotif of tension,
Yes. Yes.
Every single time he goes by, it's like, oh, he's not today, I've not been called on today, but at
Yes.
some point it's going to happen, we're living on borrowed time.
Yes. That's so true. That's so true. It's a really powerful movie. Really powerful movie without pushing too hard to be powerful, if that makes any sense. I mean, I really feel like watching his movies, his historical films, that I feel like they've opened a window into the past and letting me look into it. And I know
Mm,
that there's no way you could really judge, like, is this accurate? Unless you were alive during that time, and pretty much everybody from that time is gone now. But it feels different. Like, I feel like it's a different way of existing in the world. It's very moving. It's
mm.
very moving to be able to look at people who are not like you and see the ways in which they are like you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you referred earlier to sort of his movement towards Christianity, or his I don't know if he ever was particularly away from Christianity, but certainly Knight of Cups seems to suggest that there was a period where he lost his faith and then it came back. And even Tree of Life, it was, brother, you led me to his door. It was
Yeah.
this sense of a search for faith. The relationship between this film and Christianity is obviously very tight. Franz Jagerstatter is a Catholic, and he's been, this film was shown in the Vatican, a screening at which Malick was present. But it doesn't, to me, have a orthodoxy that is in any way sort of off-putting, or I don't feel like I'm watching Catholic propaganda here. I don't feel like this is a figure that even, and the reason for that is he works as a sacristan in the local church. He's cleaning up, and there's a dialogue between him and the sort of church painter who's sort of painting the murals on the inside of the church. And
Yeah.
this guy gives this wonderful speech about how, which is particularly interesting in the light of we're waiting for Way of the Wind at the moment that we're recording this, of how he's expected to portray Jesus. People want me to paint Jesus in a certain way.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being more like, along the lines of that Doobie Brothers song, Jesus is just all right with me.
Wouldn't it be
You
hilarious if
know,
it's just 5 minutes long as well?
that would be great. Yeah, it plays over the end credits, and there's animated drawings like it's a Pixar film. Yeah, that's no, I don't think that's going to happen. But definitely, he does seem to me like whatever gets you through the night sort of Christian. I can't
Mm.
imagine him, wishing that somebody would be condemned to hell for something they've said. I just don't get that vibe from his movies at all.
No, and he's very open to, a Knight of Cups. You have Peter Matheson from, who wrote The Snow Leopard and is a big, Buddhist scholar, and Voyage of Time. You have a lot of appeals to sort of Eastern religions. I don't feel that there's a dogmatic approach, and even in terms of the painter talking to Franz in this film, he sort of says, they want me to paint this person that would comfort them. They'll look at it and they'll say, if I was there, I wouldn't participate in the crucifixion, you know?
You're reminding me of this, when supposedly Malick wrote a letter to Scorsese after he saw Silence. And I think Scorsese quoted it, and I think here's the quote here is, one comes away wondering what our task, this is referring to Silence, one comes away wondering what our task in life is. What is it that Christ asks of us, and what new shapes will he assume in these dark times? like those of old. He might appear, as you show, even in those who oppose the faith or betray it, like Judas or Pilate. His love seems to be wider for it.
Which seems to be very consistent with what we have in A Hidden Life of the Christ is, or the idea of Christianity seems to be in a moment of great darkness. There's no consolation in just, I'm just going to go to church and keep my head down and have a conventional view of this. I mean, there are priests in this film and there are bishops in this film, and they will only help you up to a certain point.
Yep. There's definitely a sense of, and that's all sort of bound together with this incredible social architecture that he portrays so well, that values, there are values that a society is based on, and these values are reaffirmed through the rituals of work, of family, of spirituality. But a lot of it seems to be about ensuring that things are orderly and predictable. And you very quickly start to wonder, do they really mean it when they quote scripture? Do they really mean it? Or is it just words? Is it just something that they say? And, it's really masterful the way this film shows lots and lots of characters coming at him, not as a screaming, belligerent, damn you, salute the Fuhrer sort of people, but as people who come to him as friends. To paraphrase Goodfellas, they come to you as friends.
Yeah.
And like, are you sure you really want to be doing this? Are you sure? Is it really helping your family? Aren't you putting a burden on your family? Is it really good for society? Are you really protesting if you're part of the army? And even the priest has a touch of that, I think. It's kind of like, I feel like there's a subtext to some of the village priests' conversations with him. Like, what are you trying to do? Mess up this church that I worked so hard to build? What's going to become of our statuary?
And in a sense, the character actor Bruno Ganz, who plays the German officer, sort of even has a sort of Pontius Pilate role with him. It's sort of like, I'm puzzled by you. The person who seems to be most puzzled by him and inquiring is actually the person, the highest up the ranking of the Nazi authorities, whereas everyone else is just trying to dissuade him. And of course, Bruno Ganz, most famously for playing Hitler he's had a huge long career actually, so I'm not sure if it's but he was in Downfall as Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, so he's played, not too many people have played both Hitler and an angel.
Yeah, in Wings of Desire, a Wim Wenders movie, excellent.
Which would make a great double feature with A Hidden Life, now that I think of it.
Also, not Van Helsing character, the Jonathan Harker character in Werner Herzog's Nosferatu as well.
Right. Yeah, that moment where Bruno Ganz's character, he questions Franz, and then after he's gone, he sits in the chair that he had been sitting in. Again, probably, I would imagine that's one of those moments that was found during rehearsals or just while they were shooting. I think about that moment a lot, and it is, you're right to compare it to that pivotal moment in the New Testament, because it does seem like this guy might have the intellectual capacity and the empathy necessary to understand the predicament of a guy like Franz, but that's never going to happen because he's a Nazi. And that expression on Bruno Ganz's face, I feel, is communicating the conflicted, maybe not consciously conflicted, but like those tremors of disquiet that he must feel. Like, why would a guy like that in that chair if there wasn't some kind of deeply, deeply, deeply buried guilt?
It reminds me, I mean, it's a very, very different tone, but there's a British comedy series called The Mitchell and Webb Experience. It's a sketch show, and they're dressed as Nazis, and one of them turns to the other and says, "Wait a minute, are we the baddies?" It's kind of saying, have you noticed what we've got on our badges? It's like a death's head. I mean, that's not good, is it? I mean, that's not
right, exactly.
That's not like they're not even hiding it. It's on the badge.
Yeah, it's right there. It's right there. Yeah, exactly.
Skulls
I don't
and
know what made me
crossbones.
think of it, but I don't know why. This is probably unrelated, but for some bizarre reason, I thought of the sketch from the old Saturday Night Live. It was the last days of Socrates, and Steve Martin plays Socrates, and he's pontificating on, Socratic things as he's awaiting his sentence. And somebody comes in and goes, "Socrates, your hemlock," and he goes, "Thanks," and downs it, and then continues talking. And then one of his followers interrupts him and says, "I'm sorry, Socrates, I just have to say, why did you drink that?" And he goes, "What do you mean?" And he says, "The hemlock is poison." And his face falls and he goes into this tirade and he goes, "All these years you've been following me around, listening to me talk, and asking me questions. Socrates, what is truth? Socrates, what is beauty? But not once did any of you people ever say to me, Socrates, hemlock is poison."
Oh, fantastic. Well, I mean, yeah, it kind of has that relevance in that, it's the obvious. I mean, again, I think this is where a lot of the criticism of Malick feels to me wrong-headed, and there's an element that it's almost like a bad faith criticism, which is this idea of like, oh, he's naive and in asking these questions or in portraying things as being good and bad, there's a moral question at the heart of war, oh yeah, dumbass, as if we didn't know. And it's just like, well, isn't that a really important question? I mean, why, what else are we disturbing your enjoyment of Hacksaw Ridge right now? Is that why you're not allowed to ask these, I mean, philosophical questions? Let's just take away the word philosophical and just call them questions. Isn't it important to question stuff?
Yes, yes, yes. That could have been the tagline on the poster. Isn't it important to question stuff?
That should be the subtitle of the book next to the next edition.
Yes, 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 yes. Terrence Malick, colon.
Terrence Malick questions stuff. A series of interviews.
Oh no, it's really it's a brilliant film, and all of his there's really none of his films that I don't like. There's a couple from that period where he's kind of noodling around in Austin with digital equipment, and even the actors who were in his movies, they weren't sure what movie they were in, and they were a little surprised if they showed up in one film and not another. And there's people like Antonio Banderas is in one of them for like 4 seconds. And it's, but that's how he rolls. Like, you have to know that when you work with Terrence Malick, you might end up not even being in the film. And, I remember when I saw The Thin Red Line for the first time, I didn't know George Clooney was in it. And then suddenly there's like one scene with George Clooney. And then he's never heard from again. And this was a time where like movies starred George Clooney.
Oh, yeah. It was on the poster. It was on the poster. His name was on the poster. There's a funny story that Billy Weber told me about how they were cutting down Thin Red Line and they wanted to get to a certain time, and he said, "Look, there's a really easy option here. Just cut out the whole bit with George Clooney because you introduce him way too late. He's we've already covered authority and all the rest of it, and you go from Jim Caviezel's grave." Cut that, and then you cut it to Sean Penn walking past the cemetery, and you've got one grave going to a bunch of graves, and it's a thematic link, and that's it. End of movie. He goes into the boat, and they're back off to the next theater of war. And Malick went, no, can't do it. I really like that scene. I want it to stay. 2 weeks later, Billy Weber gets a phone call from Terrence Malick saying, "Yeah, actually, you're right. Let's cut it." And it was like, "Terry, the trailers are out. The posters have been printed. We can't do it." And so that was, if you want to, you can kind of do that on your own and sort of do a little fan edit. And I think I don't mind. There is a bit of like, oh my God, this guy's turned up from central casting and he doesn't know anything and he's in charge now. There is that irony to him appearing that they've sent like the Hollywood version of a officer.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about. I've been thinking a lot recently about the giants of 70s and 80s cinema who are still with us, and they're not going to be with us much longer. the human lifespan being what it is. How many more years do we have left with Martin Scorsese? Will Francis Coppola ever make another movie? Will Ridley Scott continue to make 2 movies a year?
Could Ridley Scott move one of his movies over to somebody else?
Right. He's like turning into the Steven Soderbergh of blockbusters. Like, the joke, like in the time it took us to have this conversation, Steven Soderbergh made another movie. But Malick is absolutely one of the greats, and he's up there too. Michael Mann, I think it's like 81 or 82. When these people go, there's no one to replace them. The ecosystem that created them doesn't exist anymore. They're able to continue working on a grand scale because there's this accumulated reputation as a result of them having been around for decades and being significant in some way for decades. I don't know who steps in and fills in. There are a number of incredibly talented filmmakers who I think are substantive, who are making movies somewhat in that vein. I think of Paul Thomas Anderson in particular, but these are the mighty redwoods of cinema. I can't wait to see Malick's Jesus movie. And it's interesting that he and Scorsese have one coming out, I guess, not exactly at the same time, but they're being made contemporaneously, right? And that they've been in communication. And I would like to know a little bit more about that interaction after Malick saw Silence. I wonder if that spurred him to do A Hidden Life. I wonder if there's a bit of back and forth going.
I definitely think they read each other's scripts and watch each other's movies. I think there's more from what I've learned. There's more intercommunication that Malick has with people than you would think. That would be than he's publicly acknowledged or is publicly referred to by the people involved.
Well, he does. I often have to correct people when they describe Terrence Malick as a recluse. He's not a recluse. He just doesn't give interviews.
Yeah.
He talks to people. He goes to, if you hang around Austin long enough, you'll see him bird watching in a park or eating in a restaurant. And the self-centeredness of the press is the only reason why he's described as if he's like this guy who disappeared 20 years ago. Even that period, that 20-year period when he wasn't making movies, he was around. He was taking meetings. It's not like he decided not to make movies for 20 years. He just had all these things he was working on that for whatever reason didn't get funded. He was just a filmmaker trying to get it done. But there is something almost 19th century about the way he sees art and the way he practices it that is refreshing. He's not a person who's ever going to describe one of his own films as content. I don't think he probably loses a lot of sleep over the state of cinema. He seems to have adapted pretty well to the new tools, especially for somebody who had been making things the old way for all the way up until Tree of Life. Or actually, no, I think it was To the Wonder was his last movie shot on film. And I think his digital phase is beautiful. Absolutely beautiful, and maybe in a slightly different way than his film shot on film. But there was one of his movies, I feel like it was maybe the beginning of To the Wonder, where there's a brief sequence that's shot with what looks like a camcorder.
Yeah,
Do you remember this?
They're using phone cameras as well, and he did a thing for Voyage of Time where he sent these boxes of like Japanese cameras, which were basically nascent versions of GoPros. They're the same concept, very small, boxy little things. You can take them anywhere, you can wear them. And he sent them around the world to a bunch of people, and just with a list of things he wanted filming. And in the 90-minute version of the documentary, there are clips of this. There are clips of almost like sort of found footage almost of religious ceremonies or people washing things in a river, and it's just like it's in the middle of this immense, beautiful photography of the natural world doing its thing as well. And so that to me is a very telling idea that often that strand of like innovation and interest in the world as it is now, even as he's still doing his Malick thing, he's open to, oh, you go off and just take a camera and shoot some stuff.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, he's a very special filmmaker, and I've heard stories like that as well from people who've worked with him. Of that supposedly on the New World, on the camera crew there was always one. There were multiple cameras going at any given time, and one of the cameras would always be sent away to shoot inserts, and there were no instructions. It was just go off today, be by yourself, and shoot things. And a lot of those inserts, Terrence Malick inserts of flora and fauna, ended up in the movie. They
Days of Heaven.
The...
Same thing with Days of Heaven.
Yeah.
There's a third cinematographer on Days of Heaven, who doesn't, we always talk about Nestor and we talk about Haskell Wexler and the big argument about who should have got the. I think I saw you do a Q&A on stage once. Via YouTube.
Haskell Wexler, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't stalking you in the audience. I was stalking you on the internet.
Well, he said, Haskell Wexler said that he said, I sat there with a stopwatch one time just to see how much of footage was mine. He said, I think 51% of it was mine, but he didn't feel like I should be credited as the cinematographer. I mean, that was, obviously the Guild has ways that you deal with that, but also he was stepping into a template that someone else had created. So it's a bit like, I would imagine, rewriting someone else's script. Like if you have any decency at all, you pay tribute to the fact that somebody before you had to sit there and look at a blank page. And I don't particularly care what anyone has to say on the subject because it's a fact. It's easier to rewrite than to write.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Always. And I have no sympathy at all for people who, they say, oh, yeah, it was a page one rewrite, as if to say, I didn't have any help from the previous draft. It's like, yeah, you did, if only to show you what you didn't want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, places not to go, roads not to follow.
His movies don't seem like the sorts of productions where people would get hung up on that too much. It seems like it would be contrary to the spirit of the enterprise. Like everybody by this point knows how Terrence Malick works, and that, if you're an actor, even if you're the main character, you might or might not actually be in the movie at the end. And, if you shot something, it might or might not be used, and so on. And it almost feels like it's an unbelievably huge independent movie where, like the main actors are helping the crew move equipment around, and it's really very refreshing to hear stories from. I remember Ben Affleck talking about working with him, and it seemed like he was being, I don't know if he was being denigrating or if he was just highlighting the absurdity of it, but he was saying, you'll be in the middle of an intense scene with another actor, and all of a sudden the camera will move away from you and go up to follow a squirrel as it climbs up a tree. And I'm reading that and I'm thinking, yeah, but that's what makes it a Terrence Malick movie.
John C. Reilly said a similar thing when they were filming Thin Red Line. There's a scene where they're on the back of a truck and the camera is, they're going into an army base and there are planes landing. So it's a hugely sort of complicated, you have to time it and all the rest of it. And they were going in and Terrence Malick grabbed the shoulders of the cinematographer and goes, red-tailed hawk. And they sort of switched the camera away from all this production value that had been, the planes were going to have to circle around and come back again and all the rest of it because he wanted to get this hawk. And he was like, yeah, well, we can do that again, but that red-tailed hawk isn't going to be here. So I've got to get that now. That's the bit I've got to get now. And that's like, yeah, I guess if that's where your values are, you do you.
Well, it's just my own personal opinion, but I think that if more filmmakers had that sensibility of, I don't care how much this choreographed military set piece cost, we're never going to see that red-tailed hawk again. Cinema as a whole would be far more lively.
and would be far more varied. We would see individual visions rather than corporate previs. I've seen it 1,000 times before. I remember Brian De Palma talking about pre-visualization, saying it's the triumph of cliche because everybody just shows what they've done 100 times on 100 different movies. So how are you feeling about the approach of Way of the Wind? I mean, my gut feeling is that it's going to come out sometime this year. Could be Cannes, could be Venice.
I don't know. I mean, I would never prognosticate about Terrence Malick. I mean, you
Mm.
just know. And I hope we see it. Hope we see it soon. And I hope there's several more movies after that. And I'm very, very interested to see it, as I always am. Terrence Malick making a movie about Jesus is really like, why didn't he do this sooner, given what we know about him? I don't think it's a coincidence, and he and Scorsese are both in their 80s and are making movies about Jesus, and they're Christians. These questions do tend to arise in one's head as one gets older, and I hope we have a lot more time with both of them, with all of them, with all of the filmmakers who are out there practicing their art. Like, I wish that every filmmaker could live to be 100 and make a movie a year. And I know the economy is not set up to to allow for that, but that would be my wish.
Redwoods in this economy, Matt. It's been wonderful talking to you, Matt, and a real pleasure. And let's get together soon and talk about that Asteroid City book.
Oh, I would love that. All right, take care.